hitting in the static. This ain't no bedtime story, son, it's prophetic. Encrypted signals from the shadows of the garden. We dig where the dirt got secrets, no parting. Microphone alchemist, scriptures with a twist. Peep the frequency, seeds in the mist. We drop bars like plagues, revelations in the cadence. Broadcasting truth while they trapped in surveillance. Wisdom with a watchman's blade. Fourth watch style while your whole system fade. Blood moons, Nephilim, echoes in the pine. Sasquatch stomping through the fault lines of time. We ain't mainstream, we ancient stream. Cipher with the prophets, decode the dream. So if you tuned in, better guard your mind. It's broadcasting seeds and we breaking the design. Yeah. Straight from the broadcast studio. Hidden in the static.
You ever notice how sometimes I'm Bennett Tanton, and this is Broadcasting Seeds, a show about the corners of reality they stopped teaching you in school because those corners make people uncomfortable. So tonight, we walk into one of those corners where the divine and the absurd cross swords, where heaven acts like a general with a plan and the sun takes orders. Picture Joshua, ragged, sunburnt, carried the smell of campfire in his clothes. He looks up outside Jericho and finds a man standing with a drawn sword. Not a general of men, a commander of the Lord's army who says, in effect, I'm not on your team, and I'm not on the other team either. Now, that encounter sits in the text like a bruise that you just can't ignore. Then there's Jericho, the city that fell not to siege engines, but to rhythm, trumpets, and a shout. The walls folded like something made of paper and breeze. Later on, a different field of battle, Joshua looks up into the sky and says roughly, "Son, you hang there. Will you?" And the text tells us the sun stood still until the nation finished avenging itself. So what do we do with scenes like this, where celestial officers show up, walls obey sound, and the sun apparently takes a break on command? Tonight we will treat the book of Joshua like a map and then walk its strange terrain, theology, archaeology, physics, adjacent speculation, and the ethics of holy war, and what this all means when you try to square the supernatural with the everyday human heart. If you dig this kind of deep, weird, like, share, and drop a reviews wherever you get podcasts. That's how Broadcasting Seeds grows, and it helps me bring you more episodes that poke the sacred and then write back notes about what bleeds out. So, Section 1. The commander in the shadows who leads Yahweh's army. There's a moment just before the siege of Jericho that barely gets a page in most Bibles. But if you pause long enough, it's one of the most loaded supernatural encounters in all of Scripture. Joshua standing alone near Jericho, probably scouting, probably tired, and out there on the barren ridge he sees a man with a sword drawn, not sheathed, not resting, drawn. That detail matters. In the ancient world, you didn't draw your blade unless something was about to happen. So Joshua does what any good commander would do. He calls him out. Are you for us or for our enemies? And the answer is neither. But as commander of the army of Yahweh, I have now come. That's Joshua 5:14. And it might be the most cryptic, don't ask me which team I'm on reply in history. The text says Joshua falls face down and worships. This isn't casual respect, it's reverence. And here's where the theological fork in the road appears. Some scholars say this commander was the archangel Michael, Israel's celestial protector mentioned in Daniel and Revelations. Others, and I tend to lean this way, see it as something much more, a Christophany, an appearance of the pre-incarnate Christ himself. Why? Because the being accepts worship. Angels don't do that. When John tried to worship one in Revelation 19, the angel shut him down hard. Don't do that. Worship God. But this commander didn't reject Joshua's posture. Instead, he tells him to take off his sandals because the ground itself is now holy. Sound familiar? That's exactly what God told Moses at the burning bush in Exodus 3. So here's the picture. Before the walls fell, before the trumpets blared, heaven's chain of command was already being revealed. The human commander, Joshua, was reporting in to the divine commander-in-chief. And this wasn't just symbolic. The Hebrew word for army is savia. Doesn't mean just foot soldiers, it means the host of heaven, angelic battalions, a cosmic military apparatus that moves when God moves. Now, why does that matter? Because it reframes the whole conquest of Canaan. It wasn't merely a land grab, it was a spiritual operation. The visible war was only half the story. The other half was unseen. You had entities, powers, and principalities entrenched in the land. And when Joshua's army crossed the Jordan, they weren't just fighting Canaanites. They were taking back territory corrupted by ancient spiritual influence, what Deuteronomy 32 calls gods of the nations. Even Dr. Michael Hauser, a respected biblical scholar, argued that this campaign was about reclaiming sacred geography, places ruled by fallen divine beings since Babel. Joshua's wars weren't just battles of swords and shields, they were the visible reflection of a divine reclamation project. And maybe that's the bigger lesson here, that spiritual warfare isn't some abstract Sunday school concept. It's structured, it's disciplined, it has hierarchy. There are ranks, orders, and divine timing. In other words, heaven doesn't just wing it. Joshua wasn't just a soldier, he was a participant in a much older, larger war, one that began before humans ever picked up a weapon. So as we move forward, remember that the commander didn't come to take sides, he came to take over. And the real question might not be whose side is God on, but who is truly aligned under his command. Section 2, Jericho, the frequency of faith and the collapse of empire. When people talk about Jericho, they often imagine a children's story, a marching band, a shout, and some cartoon walls tumbling like building blocks. But if you strip away the Sunday school varnish, this story reads like something that belongs in both a war chronicle and a quantum physics textbook. The Israelites had just crossed the Jordan, no siege towers, no battering rams, no engineers, just a nomadic army following a box overland with gold, the Ark of the Covenant, that symbolized the literal presence of Yahweh. And when they reached Jericho, a heavily fortified city with double walls and watchtowers, God gave Joshua what sounded like an absurd strategy. March around the city once each day for 6 days. On the seventh day, march 7 times, blow the trumpets, and then shout, and the walls will fall. No catapults, no infiltration, just sound. Now, if you think about that militarily, it's nonsense. But if you think about it metaphysically or even scientifically, it starts to hum with possibilities. Let's start with the sound itself. The trumpets they used weren't brass band instruments. They were shofars. They were ram's horns that produced a low, resonant blast. Ancient Near Eastern cultures believed that sound could disturb the unseen world. The Canaanites used chants and wails in rituals for the same reason. But the Israelites were told to use sound in obedience, a sacred frequency commanded by Yahweh himself. Modern physics tells us that sound is vibration, energy traveling through matter. Under the right conditions, certain frequencies can literally shatter solid objects. Think about opera singers cracking glass, or more advanced examples like modern military researchers have explored acoustic resonance weapons that use focused sound to incapacitate or even destroy structures. So now, hundreds of shofars echoing through a narrow valley, bouncing off limestone walls, while thousands of voices roar in unison. Could sound have played a physical role? Possibly. But what makes Jericho unique is the faith and frequency work together. The command wasn't just about decibels, it was about obedience, timing, and alignment with divine will. When faith and obedience move in sync, strange things tend to happen. You could say Jericho's walls didn't fall because of sound, but through it, like a spiritual resonance event where heaven and earth briefly harmonized. Archaeology adds another wrinkle. Excavations at Jericho, particularly those by John Garstag and later Bryant Wood, found a city whose walls had collapsed outward, a rare direction for destruction. Usually, invading forces knocked walls inward. Outward collapse suggests something else, maybe an internal shock wave or pressure wave from beneath or even within. Whether that's divine intervention, tectonic coincidence, or the spiritual equivalent of a sonic boom, that depends on your worldview. But the symbolism here runs deeper than rubble. Jericho was the gateway fortress of Canaan, the first major obstacle between Israel and the Promised Land. Taking it down without a single sword swing wasn't just efficient, it was psychological warfare. It told the world and the unseen powers behind it that Israel's God didn't play by human rules. And that's the uncomfortable part for modern minds. This story suggests the creation itself responds to divine command, sound, vibration, and faith aren't just metaphors. They're the mechanics of spiritual reality. The universe doesn't ignore obedience. It resonates with it. When Joshua's people shouted, the vibration wasn't just in the air, it was in the moral and spiritual fabric of creation. The walls didn't crumble because of noise. They collapsed under the weight of divine authority being released through sound. So next time you think faith is passive, remember Jericho. Sometimes faith sounds like thunder, and sometimes it sounds like the frequency that undoes empires. Section 3, The Day the Sun Stood Still, Time, War, and Divine Intervention. Now we move from the walls of Jericho to the sky itself, to one of the most baffling verses in all of Scripture, Joshua 10. Israel is in the middle of a desperate battle with the Amorite kings. The day's getting late, the shadows are stretching long, and Joshua knows if the sun goes down, the enemy will slip away into the dark. So he does something only a man convinced of heaven's backing would dare to do. He prays out loud, not quietly, not symbolically, and commands the universe. Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and moon over the valley of Ajalon. And according to the text, it happened. The sun stood still and the moon stopped until the nation took vengeance on their enemies. There has never been a day like this before or since when the Lord listened to a human being. Joshua 10:12 through 14. So let that sink in. The writer isn't talking metaphor here. He's describing an astronomical suspension, time itself kneeling before divine authority. Now, theologians, skeptics, and scientists have all taken their swings at this one for centuries. Some say it's poetic language. Maybe the light lasted longer, maybe the reflection, maybe a localized optical illusion. Others have suggested a long solar eclipse, atmospheric refraction, or some kind of rotational slowdown. But every explanation hits the same wall. If this was literal, it wasn't just an odd sunset, it was a cosmic event that broke the clock of creation for a moment. There's an old NASA myth, widely circulated and thoroughly debunked, about computers finding a missing day in Earth's rotation. It makes for a great sermon story, but no, NASA didn't stumble into Joshua's miracle in a database. Still, the persistence of that rumor says something about how deeply this story resonates with people. We want it to be true, not just theologically, but physically. We want to know that time itself can be rewritten if God wills it. Now, here's where things just get interesting. In ancient civilizations around the same rough time frame, the Chinese, the Mayans, even the Aztecs, there are records of a long day or a missing night. Correlation isn't proof, but it's enough to make historians scratch their heads a little bit. If multiple ancient people saw something strange in the sky, maybe Joshua wasn't the only one witnessing the impossible. Then there's the quantum thought experiment. What if God didn't stop time? What if he bent it? What if what Joshua experienced wasn't cosmic suspension, but temporal dilation? A moment when divine will altered human perception, slowing reality for those who needed more daylight, while the rest of the universe ticked along as usual. Einstein's relativity tells us time is elastic, not absolute. So if physics allows for time to bend, it's not unthinkable that the creator could twist it on his command. And maybe that's the point. The miracle wasn't just in the sky, it was in the partnership. God didn't act despite Joshua, he acted because of him. The Lord listened to a man, the verse says. That line hints like a thunderclap. It's the audacity of faith, a human voice changing the tempo of heaven. In the ancient mindset, celestial bodies were more than just rocks or fireballs. They were cosmic rulers. But by commanding the sun and moon to stand still, Joshua wasn't just buying battle time. He was symbolically declaring Yahweh's dominion over every other so-called god in the heavens. The sun god, the moon god, all of them froze under divine authority. So whether you see this as physics defying intervention, mythic hyperbole, or the ultimate show of divine sovereignty, one truth holds steady. Heaven listens to bold faith. The sun stood still that day, not for spectacle, but for obedience, for a man who believed that if God promised victory, even time would make a way for it. Section 4, the Divine Council and Celestial War Map. If you've stuck with me this far, you've seen God's army move on the ground, his voice move through sound, and his will move through time. Now, we pull back even further, way past the battlefield, past the walls, past the orbit of the sun itself, into the unseen boardroom of creation. This is where it gets very weird and very ancient. The idea of a divine council that Yahweh presides over, a heavenly assembly of spiritual beings who help administer creation, isn't New Age spin. It's in the Bible. Hidden in plain sight, Psalm 82 says, God stands in the assembly of El. In the midst of gods, he renders judgment. Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9 describe how God divided up the nations according to the number of the sons of God. In that worldview, the earth isn't just divided by borders, it's divided by spiritual jurisdiction. Each nation, each region had a delegated spiritual authority. Call them lesser Elohim, or like little g gods, angelic princes, or in darker cases, fallen powers. But Israel was Yahweh's own portion. The land, the covenant, and the people were his direct domain. That's the real subtext of Joshua's conquest. It wasn't just about land, it was a reclamation campaign. Canaan wasn't merely inhabited by people who worshipped idols. It was a territory under the governance of spiritual rebels, powers that had once been part of God's court and decided to run their own empires. Michael Heiser in The Unseen Realm makes a compelling argument that the conquest of Canaan was a divine repossession of sacred geography. The phrase driving out the nations isn't just political rhetoric. It's spiritual eviction. Every victory, every fallen city represented Yahweh taking back turf from the cosmic squatters who had claimed it. And think about the symbolism here. Joshua's name, Yeshua, means Yahweh saves. Yehoshua, Joshua, means Yahweh saves. It's the same root as Yeshua, Jesus. The physical conquest under Joshua mirrors the spiritual conquest under Christ. One drove out giants and idols, the other drove out demons and death. Both were reclaiming what rightfully belonged to God. Now, this framework, divine council, cosmic hierarchy, spiritual territories, isn't just Old Testament mythology. It shows up in Daniel when the Prince of Persia resists Gabriel's message for 21 days. And Michael, the great prince who stands guard over your people, steps in. It's angelic warfare mapped into geopolitics. Real nations, real conflicts, but influenced by something unseen. It makes you wonder, how much of what we call world affairs are still reflections of that same invisible tug of war? The powers behind thrones, behind ideologies, behind chaos itself. Maybe the divine council isn't ancient history. Maybe it's still convening and the nations are just pawns in the same celestial chess match. And here's the strange symmetry. The book of Joshua begins with the commander of Yahweh's army standing before a man and declaring sovereignty. Revelation ends with a rider on a white horse leading the armies of heaven to finish what Joshua started, the final reclamation of the world itself. So when we talk about Joshua's war, we're not just talking about Bronze Age tribal conflicts. We're looking at an operation ordered from a divine war room, part of a campaign that stretches from the ancient Near East to the present spiritual landscape. The names change: Canaan, Persia, Babylon, Washington, but the pattern remains. There are still rulers, authorities, and powers in high places. There are still Jerichos that need to fall, and there are still commanders giving orders. The only real question is whether we recognize which side we're standing on, and whether we're following orders from heaven or from the shadows. Section 5, the paradox of holy war, judgment, redemption, and the modern battlefield. So when we talk about Joshua's conquest, it's easy to get lost in the spectacle. You've got collapsing walls, angelic generals, and frozen suns. But beneath all that wonder lies a brutal reality that has bothered scholars and believers alike for centuries. How do we reconcile a God of love with a God of war? Joshua's campaign was, by every measure, a war of total destruction. Entire cities were burned, populations wiped out. The term used is harem, the ban, meaning devoted to destruction. Not for greed, not for conquest, but for holiness. And that's where the paradox begins. From our modern lenses, it feels almost irreconcilable. But to understand why it's happened, you have to remember the spiritual framework we've built across the last 3 sections. The Canaanite nations weren't just rebellious people. They represented an ecosystem of corruption, child sacrifice, ritual bloodletting, temple prostitution, and demonic worship that had saturated the land. In other words, it wasn't just moral decay, it was spiritual infestation. The command to devote to destruction wasn't genocide, it was an exorcism on a national scale. Yahweh was purging a land that had been spiritually poisoned for generations. The same way Jesus later casts demons out of a man so corrupted he lived among tombs. This was that, but magnified to the scale of nations. Now, that doesn't make it comfortable, and it shouldn't. The book of Joshua isn't meant to be sanitized. It's meant to show us that holiness costs blood, that judgment isn't abstract. It's straight messy, devastating, and final. But it also sets the stage for something much greater, the transition from physical conquest to spiritual warfare. Joshua waged wars with swords and trumpets. Jesus waged war with truth and sacrifice. One drew blood to claim land. The other shed his own blood to reclaim souls. It's the same cosmic war, just fought in a different theater. Paul echoes this when he writes in Ephesians 6, "Our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." Joshua's war was physical, but it mirrored the invisible reality, a rehearsal for the final act when Christ would descend upon the realm, confront the powers head on, and disarm them not through destruction, but through resurrection. So how does this translate into our world? A world of drones and psyops and information wars. Because make no mistake, warfare has evolved, but the spirit behind it really hasn't. The same principalities that inspire empires and idols now operate through algorithms, propaganda, and moral confusion. It's not about territory anymore. It's about consciousness. The battlefield has shifted to the human heart and mind. And that's where the story of Joshua becomes prophetic. His generation was called to purge physical idols. Ours is called to purge digital and ideological ones. His trumpet blast tore down walls of stone. Our voices must tear down walls of deception. The commander of the Lord's army still walks among us, but instead of wielding a drawn sword, he calls us to wield discernment, conviction, and the word itself. The sun that stood still becomes a metaphor for time extended by grace, for God halting the natural order so his people could finish the mission. Maybe that's where we are now, in that extended day, a pause in history before the final light fades and judgment resumes. So when you read Joshua, don't just see a warrior covered in dust and blood. See a type, a symbol of something cosmic and ongoing. His mission wasn't just to occupy land, it was to prepare the way for the ultimate Yeshua, to come and finish the war once and for all. And maybe that's the real sun that stood still. Not a celestial event, but a divine mercy. A delay in the setting of judgment so that redemption could reach us. Maybe the question isn't why would God wage war? Maybe it's what if war was the only language evil would understand? Joshua's story reminds us that the line between judgment and mercy, destruction and deliverance, runs right through the heart of every battle, ancient or modern. So you've just heard the story of Joshua, the commander, the servant, the witness to miracles so vast that even the heavens stopped spinning for a day. But if you've been listening closely, you know this wasn't just about swords, trumpets, and ancient walls. It was about something far deeper, a pattern repeating through history, right up to where you're standing now. Joshua's concept was a story of what happens when heaven breaks through the veil of the natural world, when the commander of the Lord's army, the same one who stood before him with a drawn sword, reminds us that there's a chain of command stretching far beyond our understanding. And that war, the one Joshua fought, the one we're still fighting, isn't about land anymore. It's about allegiance. Maybe the walls of Jericho today aren't stone and mortar, but they're built from fear, apathy, or the illusion that the unseen world is just myth. But every wall can fall. Every deception can crumble when truth is carried in faith and the trumpet sounds from within the soul. So as you move through your week, remember this. You're living in the long shadow of Joshua's son, the day that refused to die so God's people could finish their battle. Maybe that's what this whole modern age is. One long sunset where grace holds the light just a little longer before the final night begins. And that's what Broadcasting Seeds is all about. Finding those moments where history, faith, and mystery all collide, and asking what they mean for us right now in this strange in between we call modern life. So if this episode stirred something in you, if it challenged how you see the world, or maybe reminded you that there's still a divine hand guiding history, could you do me a favor? Like, share, and review the show. That's where we grow this thing. That's how the seeds reach new ground. So until next time, keep your eyes open, your spirit sharp, and your heart anchored in the truth, because in a world full of noise and shadow, discernment is your strongest weapon.
Sun refused to move, heaven held its breath. War wasn't just on earth that day, it was everywhere. Ha! It was everywhere. Steel meets sky, faith meets flesh. I'm battling demons, wearing power and dress. Kingdoms fall when obedience speaks. Trumpets echo through the hearts of the weak. Fire in the heavens, commands from the throne. Angels align where the shadows have grown. A war of light in a world gone blind. Time froze still, and the sun redefined. When the sun stood still, we stood unbroken. Heaven roared and the earth was shaken. Every wall fell, every curse was spoken. Blood and faith, that's how the war was waged. Blood and faith, that's how the war was waged. Blood and faith, that's how the war was waged. Modern prophets with digital scars, fighting holy wars under neon stars. Scrolls turn screens, swords turn words. Truth gets buried while the lies get heard. But I see angels in formation high, tactical wings cutting through the sky. This ain't religion, this is recon fire. Spirit of Joshua, raise the empire. Tear down the towers, burn the code. Purge the systems that steal the soul. We fight unseen, we fight unseen, we fight unseen, we fight unseen. The commander calls from the light above. The war is holy, but the weapon is love. When fighters say, when fighters say, when the sun stood still, we took our stand. Heaven drew its battle plan. The kingdom comes with trumpet sound. Every stronghold's falling down. Every stronghold's falling down. Every stronghold's falling down. The war isn't over. It just changed uniforms. Stay watchful. Stay armored. This is Broadcasting Seeds.